Hello everybody, and welcome to this next video discussion as part of the RICS Tech Partner Programme. My name is Andrew Knight and I've been with RICS for nearly 11 years now. I work within the standards, regulatory and thought leadership part of RICS, and my job is to look at the effect of data and technology and standards right across the built and natural environment, with over 130,000 members worldwide, working across land, residential, commercial, infrastructure, and right across the property life cycle, looking all the way through land acquisition, development, construction, operation, asset management, end of life. It's a very broad area where our members are positively impacted by the opportunities that data and technology bring. And today I'm really glad to have Deborah Heather join us. This is really a kind of follow-up discussion to one of our partners, UnderTheDoormat. So Deborah, great to have you on board today. Welcome to the call. And as ever, it's kind of introduction time from that perspective. And I'd love to hear about your role in this whole sort of ecosystem of short-term accommodation, the Short-Term Accommodation Association, and indeed your business as well, QII Services. So over to you, Deborah.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Really great to be here. So, long story short, I am a traditional hotelier. I spent over 20 years I'm running hotels, working in revenue management, working in sales and marketing, and as an operator, being a general manager and a managing director of hotels. I joined what is the company I'm in now about 8-9 years ago. We have gone through an evolution. Basically, we used to manage the Visit England star rating scheme. So those stars on hotels you see all over, and self-catering, and some of them were crowns, and then there was all sorts of other iterations. And we managed them until about 2017. So a real sort of cross-section of the traditional tourism market, I guess. But alongside that, as a business for many years, we've worked in other sectors. So we do verification and assessment on behalf of the MOD. So we look after their enhanced learning credits program, which is personnel basically looking at further education and verifying that. We also do something called customer service excellence for the Cabinet Office. So it really, we are an assessment body, but my heart and my whole history is in hospitality and tourism. So so that's kind of where we lean in the most part. And I think about 4 years ago, we went through a tender process with the STAA and were selected as their accreditation partner. And I think certainly in my side of the industry, accreditation is often thought of as the old-fashioned inspectors coming around and catching people out and doing tick box exercises. And to be fair, there's an element that you have to have in that, as you will know, from a compliance point of view, from health and safety. We do have to do that, but we don't dictate, and we're not prescriptive around what a standard should be like, as long as the consumer is protected. We recognise the standard of services or quality of offer, but in a kind of really sort of passive way. It's not prescriptive. It used to be. So the common standards that's there are now as they were for many years, and some businesses, so the AA still operate to them, as do Visit England and Visit Scotland. I always think of them as, you know, they confuse the issue because they have a whole list of criteria, like 2 bedside tables and a Bible and things like that, which I'm writing a letter at a desk, which who goes to a hotel to write a letter? Who writes a letter these days?
Exactly.
So so we don't do that. We do the sort of positive side of it. We encourage people and we share best practice. It's much more consultative. It's much more about being the conduits of best practice, helping them problem solve. Over COVID, that was a really big thing as well. It was kind of all the buildings are different. How do you manage it? How do you work it in the right way to protect the consumer? So we are the STAA's preferred partner, and I guess our accreditation works across a whole cross section of tourism and hospitality industries, and that's where it's sort of started to work alongside your sector.
Indeed. So tell us a bit more about the Short-Term Accommodation Association. What's their role, and what was their kind of origin story?
I guess, I mean, it's a really interesting world that we live in. There are What I would think of is traditional self-catering operations. So, as you know, I'm in the heart of Devon. There's lots
Yep.
of houses down here that are used as holiday accommodation, and those are the traditional holiday home operators. And in the States, they call them vacation rentals, if that helps anybody with perspective. The short-term rental market came around. It's demand and supply, basically, but it includes the Airbnbs of this world. It looks at almost it looks at accommodation, or it includes accommodation that could be professionally run. So you could have somebody operating, I don't know, 20 or so properties on behalf of other owners. You could have a property owner operating for, or you could have something entirely different, and what we call it's basically a host situation where it's one person, offering out their flat or a room in their flat type thing. But there was a need to recognise this sort of growing marketplace, and so the SDAA set up in the UK, led by a wonderful lady called Mary Carr, it's got all sorts of members. It's got a mixture of Airbnb, it's got Expedia, so it's got some of the platforms that are members, but it's also got a large amount of operators, so people running portfolios of properties, and really trying to be the best they can be, professionalizing what they do and pushing others. I mean, there's some great people on there. I guess the industry has a reputation of being a bit, what's the right word? Of not being particularly compliant, but actually there's a real mix, and I think that's true in tourism across the board. So whenever I look at prosecutions from EHOs, there can be just as many hotels as there can be, smaller operators, and so there's the STA's mission is really about making sure that industry is recognised, lobbying on behalf of them, but also professionalising those that are members of it.
Yeah. No, I think, to be fair, if you look in detail at any sector, there are good and less good players, aren't there? That's the reality of a sector that's diverse as that sector is. I mean, I think one of the interesting things that came out of the conversation with Under the Doormat was this kind of, and perhaps the word blurring is the wrong word, but this kind of, well, I'll use it again, this blurring of the kind of more traditional short-term accommodation as people would see it, particularly holiday focused, into this more kind of corporate market where effectively there are now people looking at that much more kind of formalized, wanting to access accommodation on a short-term basis that might turn into medium-term, and perhaps more corporate business, and indeed also more corporate asset owners thinking, well, actually we have voids here, we have accommodation that, yes, in the long term we might either want to sell or have a long-term rental, but we can be much more agile. So perhaps can you give us your perspective on how that market's changing and developing?
I think I completely agree. I think there is a lot. There is a sector that or a segment of the sector that has always been known as service departments, and I think that's kind of where the middle ground has been in the past around city centres, especially if we look in the UK. In London, there's been a large amount of service departments for people, for corporates to use. Now, clearly the STR market, and to some extent the holiday rental, the self-catering market, need to be on the professional side of compliance to be able to attract anything that's to do with corporate. There's a duty of care, and that's only become more apparent during the pandemic. There's a new travel risk ISO 31031 something out there, which is all about security, and I think companies and corporate businesses will be taking it much more seriously in terms of how they protect their travellers. Equally, that has been in the hands of the GDS, which it still is to a certain extent, but the GDS has only ever had, it's the global distribution system, sorry, for those that don't know. It's connected to the airline booking system and has always traditionally been only accessible for corporate hotels. Now, I think consumers' role or consumers' demand has changed in that consumers, whether you're traveling as a corporate, as a business traveler, or you're traveling from a leisure perspective, we have different requirements. We're also, as a world of travelers, a lot more savvy these days. I think everybody's read stories around the pandemic about deposits not coming back, or are people doing the right thing in terms of cleanliness and things like that? So that the market's just broadened, and I think in a really positive way, because for your audience, I think they have a real opportunity to join in this, depending if it fits for them or not. But actually, that whole giving consumers a choice is a natural progression for markets, isn't it? So in the GDS, they could only get corporate hotels. If you're staying 3 nights, you kind of might want to cook for yourself.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
It's the flexibility it's provided now.
And I suppose what was also interesting is the whole, I mean, you talked to that sort of, dare I say it, very kind of historical view of, can you write a letter? Have you got a side table? And I guess what's been interesting also is, to use another US term, as kind of multifamily has come over in terms of build to rent, that whole kind of experiential sense of what good looks like, as well as some of those more, as you say, very important things around deposits and how the money's handled, but that kind of quality around the experience of using a property, as opposed to just tick boxes of has it got a phone or this or that, it is, I suppose, becoming much more important. And hopefully that's been a good import across the Atlantic, that sense of the experience and the concierge and the kind of front of house type experience for all these kind of, whether it's a traditional holiday let or whether it's, something a bit more corporate.
Yeah, no, I refer to it as the uncommon standards, because I think people are looking for that authenticity. They're looking for a different experience completely, which means you can't have everything uniform, and you shouldn't have everything uniform. It's great to see people looking for a different type of experience. I went to a member of the UKAA Association's apartments in Barking just recently. And the quality level was amazing. And you could just see how well it would work with corporate housing, or for people that wanted, digital nomads, we've all heard of that. And is that going to work? And yes, it is potentially generational and all for people in certain situations, but there does seem to be a burgeoning demand for a different way of and a different type of travel. As people want to stay longer, they can work remotely. It's all of those things, isn't it? So I do think it represents an opportunity for this build to rent market, the service department side of things.
Well, indeed, and I suppose, at the risk of sounding very sort of commercial about it, asset owners want to avoid voids, that they want to avoid empty properties, and I guess they may be thinking, well, actually there's a degree of agility here with a property where, yes, X% may be let on a reasonably long-term basis, but they may have to spin, to use that phrase, a portion of that property, and also appropriately price it in a way that's perhaps also quite advantageous in terms of having that kind of that throughput. And on that point, I mean, what do you think almost the sort of the more corporate asset owners can learn about that kind of pricing model, that much more dynamic, agile pricing side, which I guess people are familiar with, dare I say, when they're trying to book a flight, on the basis every time you look, the price is different, isn't it? And you never know, is it going up, is it going down, should I, but to be blunt, it's a way of maximizing revenue, isn't it, for a particular asset?
It is. And I think actually, if you've got a mix between long and short-term lets, then there's various obvious ones. So there's let up, if you were just opening a property. There's obviously voids where they've got no long-term residents in there. But you could actually think about a portfolio that did a mixed market. So I don't know, 20% of the product could be at a different on a different type of rental agreement. But yeah, I think the thing to think about is there's operational issues, and I'm sure we're going to come on to it, but the thing to think about it from the revenue management, which is where I came from in hotels, that was copied from the airline system, and that was about maximizing demand. And I think if you're thinking about short-term lets, you could actually get some really advantageous rates as opposed to the longer-term lets. So to have a portion in that, a portion of your stock or a portfolio in that place, it could be really advantageous commercially. It's a really interesting concept from a sort of flat. I think if you can think of it as a bonus system, basically, and then I'm sure people will start working it into, asset managers will start working it into their model if they can find it works. So sorry if that's putting pressure on people, but it is an opportunity. It's definitely an opportunity.
And you mentioned there the word about sort of the operating cost, the management considerations. I mean, it's become a very strong piece with build to rent, obviously in the UK, that ultimately is that net to gross. How efficiently can you run a facility, but at the same time produce the level of service? And I guess that's presumably always been a critical issue in hospitality and traditional holiday rentals as well. So I suppose that will continue to be a real balancing point, because people will want to deliver quality, but they'll be forever thinking, well, how do I do that? I mean, do you see some trends about how people are balancing that demand for ever more kind of high quality, but at the same time the cost pressures?
Yeah, no, I think it's a juggle, and I think it will depend on each company's individual resource. So if you think about an STR market, especially if you're thinking of a city centre, it's like a hotel on wheels, is the way I always describe it, because you could be getting one apartment in a whole different area ready from another apartment, and it does need some appreciation of what hospitality requires. But there are lots and lots of companies. So in the STAA, there are not just the platforms or the people that are operating their own portfolios. There are lots of opportunities to partner up with various companies that you could outsource that to as an asset manager. You might find you have that skill set or the resource within your own property, because if you think about it, there is moving day for everybody. Actually, they're doing moving day without actually, it's literally two cases being wheeled in type scenario. Yes, they have to go and put in a kettle and a toaster and the bedding and things like that. But actually, if you appreciate what they need to get into a short-term rental, it's not as hard as it might appear to be. It does require resource. And I think the other thing is working out whether you want to distribute that yourselves or whether you want to use a partner to do that for you, because obviously in our world there are lots and lots of ways of distributing your stock around short-term rentals or even corporate housing. And actually there's going back to the GDS, Trusted Stays, which is an offshoot of UnderTheDoormat, has developed and formed a relationship and managed to get apartments onto the GDS, which is an amazing way to get into corporate business and getting corporates to book up. But also, it doesn't necessarily have to be sort of 3 nights or a week stay. There is a whole market out there called corporate housing, and if you found the right partner to try and get you to get you recognised or get your stock on their radar, that sometimes could be for 3 months. And as you said at the beginning of the conversation, Andrew, it could go for 6 months, it could go for a year. Yeah. There's people coming on contracts all over the world all of the time, and if it works for them, then it's a great message. In my misspent youth, in my early 20s, we used to find that a lot of corporate companies, when you were selling to them as hoteliers, a lot of the corporate companies were buying apartments themselves to do this very thing. They've stopped doing that per se, but they are kind of looking for other sources. They still want that accommodation. And I think more so post-pandemic, it's that sort of enclosed living area that people want to experience now.
So I mean, for an operator coming into this who's perhaps used to just very classic long-term rentals, what's the overview of the kind of whole legislative and compliance considerations they would need to take on board to start doing this sort of agile, much more short-term thing, where they're perhaps used to having a company lets or traditional private rented sector type agreements? What do they need to be considering?
I mean, it's not dramatically different, to be honest. There is very the reason what we partnered with the STAA, and we're now on the Trusted Stays part of it. For example, Trusted Stays has got through the Crown procurement system, so government employees can now use their apartments, and they did that during they had an NHS homes program, and I think they gave away something like 20,000 free room nights during the program, when NHS staff were having to go and work somewhere else and all of that. But obviously the Crown procurement team wanted some guarantees, so that's where we came into it. So we worked with them to accredit properties to make sure we have a basic accreditation called Safe, Clean and Legal, and that's deemed to be enough in terms of getting people through. And it's actually quite simple. It's looking at life and limb stuff. Yeah. So it really is Legionnaires, it's fire escapes, it's carbon monoxide type things, and I would imagine the vast majority of your audience are already there, so there's nothing scary about it.
Yeah.
If they want to go to the next level, they can get quality gradings and things like that, which also appears on the GDS. And then there's the usual stuff around sustainability, and there is the almost that you have a need to tick off that duty of care, and that's what Safe, Clean and Legal does. Everything else above that is polishing it up. It's letting people know the standard they can expect, or appealing to their buying criteria preferences around sustainability and things like that. So plenty of accreditation opportunities, really easy to do, and as I say, life and limb, that's what we're looking for, is protecting the customer in the end. So not too difficult, to be honest.
And without going into huge detail, as you say, there are those upper levels that are talking more about kind of quality above and beyond that basic compliance. I mean, what sort of things are people beginning to highlight? I mean, you mentioned sustainability there, but what other kind of things are people beginning to highlight to indicate that kind of level of quality, and arguably to try and, I suppose, in their way, differentiate from other providers?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a real shift in the market, which we would. I mean, the pandemic, I keep saying it and I shouldn't be talking about it, but it's true. It has brought on that whole sustainability agenda by 5 to 10 years. It's much more in the public eye. It's much more what travellers are looking for. And certainly when you're thinking about a corporate's ESG policy and strategies, they want to see that they're trying to be compliant in all of their procurement, basically. But it's much more than green. So as an operator, yes, you have to think about green energies and those sorts of things, which is a lot easier, as we know, with new builds. Leaky buildings are a lot more difficult. So there's almost a split between an OPEX level, a P&L level of quality, and then another level around CapEx that might need to be spent, which is kind of where the asset managers are going to need to be thinking about as we get legislation and so on and so on. But if you're thinking about return on investment and getting customers in, getting guests to stay, getting people to rent in this niche market, then it's taking the measures that improve the way they feel about themselves. So lots of it to do with community and charities, ethical performance, looking at some of the softer skills, some of the softer things around. Do you pay minimum wage? Do you a living wage? What's your modern slavery policy? Have you got an accreditation that shows that you are doing the right things in the right areas? And for me, even though we still do star ratings, because there is a mix between people wanting to know 3, 4, 5 star, they normally don't know the criteria that are involved in that, but they sort of have a perceived value for that. For me, sustainability it's definitely where it's going to be going forward. We're getting more and more demand for that type of accreditation, and in that we also include the Safe, Clean, Legal. So if somebody wanted to do it, then we check off their compliance piece as part of it, because for us, we can't have our name to something that isn't necessarily compliant. So
Exactly.
First things first, do that bit first.
And are you seeing almost a kind of a sweet spot where people, particularly where they've got a larger asset and they do want to do this mix of long, medium, short term, are you seeing a sweet spot emerging of how people are kind of doing that, or are they just going with the flow and seeing what they can almost what the market will supply them with?
It's early days, and I think it really does depend on where you are, as well as seasonality. And we're obviously we've seen a huge dip in business travel over the last 2 years. I don't think it will come back in the same format, but the corporate housing bit and the whole digital nomad piece is really, really relevant. It remains to be seen whether digital nomads become part of corporate housing, or whether they remain as a sort of leisure direct booker or something, if it was my husband and I just booking ourselves, or whether it would be the owners of our company booking that as a travel stone. That sort of is still unclear, but I think the sweet spot that we're seeing has been around a 20% part of a portfolio that's been flexible enough. And I think, one of the things we've talked about is whether actually do you get more wear and tear from doing short-term rentals because of people going in and out? Is therefore, could you have part of your portfolio specially set up for
Yeah.
that, or whether you completely flex it? And we don't quite know about that as yet. There is logic in that, and then there isn't. So because of thinking about void and let ups, actually you want to be able to do it everywhere, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And really, is there a lot more wear and tear from somebody living there as opposed to somebody traveling in and out of a property? But no, real opportunity to drive what we would in my hospitality world or hotel world, occupancy. And actually, it's really interesting. You know, you referred to them as voids. We used to look at RevPAR, so that was revenue per available room, and it is analysing
Hmm.
the empty
Yeah.
spaces basically. But I think for me, um, this side of the market has a real opportunity to maximize rate in this area, because people will pay more for a short-term let.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's the nature of the beast. In a similar vein, are you seeing once again a mix of certain asset managers building specifically for this kind of market, or is it more a case of adapting an existing portfolio? Presumably, you're seeing a lot of different approaches.
Yeah, an awful lot of different approaches, which is great to see. Again, it's that demand and supply piece. Yeah, and I think there are markets that are already nearly saturated, and I think that's the same in the long term as well as short term lets. If you think about Manchester, there's an awful lot of stock there,
Yeah.
And you know, I guess we saw the same cycles in hotels. So I did the opening of a Radisson in Leeds back in 2001. At the time, there were 450 four-star bedrooms in the in the city. By 2008, there was probably nearer 8,000,
Yeah.
and it's the same concept. It's the same thing that is going through, and actually, there's such a lot to learn by looking at a different sector and seeing how that's been modelled and moved and keep moving on. Kind of makes me think when you were doing your introduction, the thing I thought about is that I always think about is, especially where I live, all of this old stock
Mhm.
in some of the seaside towns very near me, where you think, what's going to happen to that? Is it just going to be derelict? But actually, what we need is the you know the other markets to take in the properties that have been or convert them or change them, and looking at different sectors. So I think equally, tourism will change completely as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if the hotel world then follows on and comes into long, medium, short-term apartment lets.
Well, as you say, I mean, as you know, I'm Devon born and bred as well, and you would hope that almost that digital nomad effect could have a positive effect there. I know it's in some respects, Devon and Cornwall are, and I'll use the phrase, slightly notorious for the second home piece, but hopefully the flip side is that there is plenty of accommodation there for lots of different tenure types, and that hopefully it can accommodate more people and generally help the economy down there, because it is so dependent
Definitely.
on that seasonal tourist traffic rather than all year round. As you know, it can have a slight ghost town effect in some of the villages and some of the seaside places when you're out of season, and perhaps a sense of perhaps a more sustainable rental market would be positive in all respects.
Completely agree. Completely agree. I mean, you and I both know, your favourite restaurant will be open for 2 seasons and then it'll be gone because it can't sustain the winter. And that's what we are down here, is all or nothing. And actually, when you talk to the hospitality people, given last summer's demand, they're actually hoping for a slightly quieter one, which is kind of perverse.
Exactly.
Because everything you hear about hospitality is how it's struggled, but actually it's not the same in all areas, and all is not equal. But to flatten it somehow,
Yeah,
with rental, would be an amazing thing, I think, locally.
indeed.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fascinating to chat, and I'm sure this story has a long way to run, doesn't it, in terms of the development of this market, and certainly for our members as asset managers in this case, it's great to hear that there is this increased focus on standards and quality, and it's fascinating to hear about the ESG thing, because clearly that's a huge issue for the more kind of commercial property perspective. But it's so interesting now, I think, that consumers are demanding and expecting that the kind of governance, and you say just beyond the kind of is the electricity green, that sort of stuff, they're really demanding that same level of comfort, that it's a well-governed, well-run organization that they're interacting with. I think that's, as ever, a strong driver of demand. So it's been great to talk, Deborah. Been really fascinating to hear about what's going on. I look forward to catching up again in the future.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Lovely to see you.